Well, this is going to be a somewhat short episode because there's only so much in Netflix's Hitman that's actually based on the true story of Gary Johnson, an investigator for the DA's office in Houston who spent more than a decade portraying a fake hitman. He did so in order to catch people who were trying to pay to have others killed. To its credit, the film is upfront about its departure from the facts. The prologue informs us, what you're about to see is a somewhat true story, inspired by the life of Gary Johnson. However, if the real Gary Johnson had lived to see director Richard Linklater's version of his life, I can't imagine he'd be too pleased with how he's portrayed, especially since the movie turns him into a cold-blooded murderer in the end. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's address how much of the movie is actually based on the true story of Gary Johnson. In Hitman, Gary Johnson is portrayed by Top Gun Maverick actor Glen Powell, who co-wrote the film with director Richard Linklater. In the movie, Gary is an introverted college professor who does part-time tech work for the New Orleans Police Department. When an undercover officer who poses as a fake hitman is suspended for beating up some teenagers, on a whim, they ask Gary to step in to play the role, as if it's not a big deal and they're too lazy to find, basically anyone else with more experience than Gary, who's not even a cop. I mean, it's not like there's anything at stake except for the very life of the person their suspect wants to pay to have killed, or will end up killing themselves if Gary doesn't do a convincing job at their meeting. There's apparently no reason to be overly concerned that he might screw it up or not be able to pull it off. And as you might have guessed, despite it surprisingly working out in the movie and Gary being a natural, it didn't go down that way in real life. In reality, Gary Johnson had significant experience in law enforcement and working undercover. Instead of working full-time as a professor, the real Gary Johnson was a staff investigator for the Harris County District Attorney's Office in Houston. The movie fictionalizes the setting as being in New Orleans. Gary did work as a professor, but only part-time 2 nights a week, teaching a class on general psychology and another on human sexuality. Unlike the movie, Gary had significant previous experience as a cop. After serving in Vietnam, Gary had worked as a sheriff's deputy in Louisiana, and then in the mid-1970s, he did undercover work for the Port Arthur Police Department, playing an addict looking to make drug buys. As an investigator for the District Attorney's Office in Houston, Gary helped gather physical evidence and find witnesses for prosecutors. He tracked down stolen cars and he helped with stakeouts. He was even shot during an arrest in 1986. So when the police eventually contacted the Special Crimes Division of the DA's office to see if they could help catch a woman who wanted to pay to have her husband killed, Gary's bosses nominated him to be the hitman, which makes sense in real life because he had previous experience working undercover. He disguised himself as a badass biker and met with the upset wife. He convinced her he was the real deal and she handed him a down payment to carry out the hit. After a few minutes, the cops swooped in to arrest her. This marked the beginning of Gary Johnson's work as a fake hitman. Unlike the movie, he didn't take over for a suspended undercover officer named Jasper, who had been previously doing the job. And while the film takes place in the present day, the real story took place predominantly in the 1990s. The movie is fairly accurate in portraying some of the various busts Gary was involved in as a fake hitman. At one meeting in the film, there's a woman who comes on to him and tells him that after her husband is gone, she'll be in her big house all alone. In real life, there was a woman who suggested they perform a certain sex act on the hood of her Cadillac. In another scene, a teenager wants to pay in video games to have his mother killed. This seems to have been inspired by a real-life meeting Gary had with a teenager who tried to pay in Atari games to have a male classmate killed who he thought was trying to move in on a girl he liked. That arrest, like others, made the newspapers. It's true that Gary was an excellent actor and he would change personas to match what he thought would best convince each client he was an actual hitman. In the Netflix movie, Gary is visited by an ex-wife he is still friends with. The real Gary Johnson, who was somewhat older than Glen Powell's character, had been married and divorced 3 times, and he was indeed still friendly with one of his ex-wives. Similar to the film, she was amazed that her quiet ex-husband who liked being alone could turn on another personality and make people think he was a vicious killer. All of this loosely accurate backstory leads up to a meeting Gary has with Adria Arjona's character, Madison Masters, who wants to have her abusive and controlling husband killed. Instead of accepting her money and having her arrested, Gary, posing as a hitman named Ron, tells her to keep the money and use it to leave her husband and start a new life. This is pretty close to what happened in real life at their meeting, according to the Texas Monthly article that inspired the film. Gary met with an unnamed woman who claimed that her boyfriend, not her husband, was abusing her and she was too scared to leave him. Prior to their meeting, Gary researched her and discovered that she was telling the truth and that she was indeed being abused. At the meeting, he didn't take her money, but rather referred her to social services and a therapist so that she could get the necessary help to leave her boyfriend and enter a women's shelter. They parted ways and Gary never saw her again. Gary says that it was the only time he turned soft, and the article ends at that point. Everything after this point in the movie is fictional. Spoiler alert, this includes their heated romance, her killing her husband, and Gary in the end killing Jasper, the cop who figured out that she did it and wants some of her husband's life insurance money. Of these completely made up parts of the movie, director Richard Linklater says that he thinks the real Gary would be bemused by the movie and how far they took it beyond his own life, with Linklater calling it a thrill ride that's pretty funny. While the movie has its funny moments, and there's certainly plenty of chemistry between the leads, I think bemused is a generous word for how the real Gary would feel about his portrayal, especially in terms of the movie's ending. After Maddie's estranged and jealous husband Ray finds out that she's been seeing Gary, who's still posing as Ron, he tries to pay to have Maddie killed. The police somehow find out that Ray is looking for a hitman, so they connect him with their fake hitman Gary. And at their meeting, Ray recognizes Gary as Maddie's boyfriend and he storms off. Here we have yet another plot hole in the fictional part of this film, because in the earlier meetings, there are surveillance cameras on these meetings, which then makes perfect sense for legal reasons. So if they see on the surveillance camera for this meeting that Gary doesn't want to reveal himself to Ray, they would wonder why that is and why Ray does recognize Gary and then storms off, which would lead them to believe or find out that Gary was the one who pulled the gun on Ray at the earlier confrontation outside the club. But for the convenience of the plot, it seems that this time there are no surveillance cameras on the meeting. Gary warns Maddie that her angry husband Ray might be coming to kill her, so she takes matters into her own hands and she kills her husband. Not in self-defense, but she shoots him while he sleeps or is passed out. It's worth noting here that in the movie, Maddie never states that she was being physically abused by her husband. Clearly, she's being emotionally abused and very controlled, but there's no mention of physical abuse. This is different from the article that inspired the film, in which the unnamed woman was being regularly battered by her boyfriend and was too terrified to leave him because of her fear of what he might do if he found her. Now, except for the fictional undercover cop Jasper, whose job as a fake hitman Gary had taken over, the rest of the department doesn't know about Gary and Maddie's relationship. The investigators begin to suspect Maddie killed her husband, and they want Gary to wear a wire to help expose her. He goes to her house and he holds up text he types on his phone, which tells her what to say to convince the police that she didn't do it. Overlooking the fact that forensics would almost certainly be able to link Maddie to her husband's murder, Gary and Maddie pull it off, and we're to believe Maddie is in the clear. That is until Jasper shows up, who's been trailing them and knows the truth. He tells them he'll expose them unless they give him some of the money from Maddie's husband's life insurance policy. He suggests they discuss it over beers because that's how all tense conversations go best, and Maddie goes to get them, and in the process she spikes Jasper's drink. He soon falls to the floor, seemingly knocked out from whatever drugs she somehow figured out might do the trick. Then to prove his commitment and to prevent Maddie from potentially going to prison for drugging a cop and possibly the premeditated murder of her husband, Gary disturbingly ties a bag over Jasper's head and Jasper begins to suffocate to death. Gary then says he can easily frame it as a suicide since Jasper's wife left him years ago and there's no one to question the story they make up about him, that Jasper is racist, misogynistic, and abusive. Gary and Maddie then playfully kiss as Jasper expires on the floor. And it's at this point you realize that these two are basically the twisted villains of the story, even if the movie doesn't want you to see them that way. Cut to a scene several years later, and Maddie and Gary are at their daughter's elementary school, where Maddie offers to volunteer with an upcoming event. You see, the filmmakers want you to know these are really good people, and it's not at all disturbing that they killed 2 people and got away with murder twice. No, that won't at all mess up their daughter when the truth comes out. In a final, supposedly brilliant piece of advice for his class, Glen Powell's character tells them, "Seize the identity you want for yourself, and whoever you want to be after this class, be them with passion and abandon." I don't know, is that really the best advice? Go out there and be someone you're not. It worked out great for me. I ended up with someone super hot and got away with murder. You see, the real Gary Johnson never strayed from who he was. He took on different personas in being a fake hitman, and he was a highly convincing actor, the Laurence Olivier of his field, the article notes. But in the end, he was still that interesting but average-looking odd guy living alone with two cats, Id and Ego, and he was seemingly fine with that. He didn't need to adopt a new identity and be someone he wasn't. It seems to be a far better moral to the story than the one the movie is trying to propose. Since most people won't know which scenes in Netflix's Hitman are part of the true story, just before the credits roll, the movie shows pictures of Gary and informs us that Gary committed 0 murders and that they made that part up. I was glad to see the filmmakers do this, if not just to prevent Gary from rolling over in his grave as to how far they stretch his true story. The chemistry between Glen Powell and Adria Arjona's characters is what primarily makes Netflix's Hitman worth a watch, even if the ending is more disturbing than a feel-good conclusion to the story. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the historical accuracy of movies and TV shows based on true stories, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.